Thanks a lot, Mike, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you already for the great talks on a topic that I really, really like. And this gave me the opportunity to revisit things I thought about in the past and haven't been for a while, so it's nice to talk about it. So when the topic of the workshop is non-complementation, as was mentioned, there's, the way I understand this, there's this old intuition, and it exists in the traditional literature, that complement clauses are somehow less complementy than other complements, especially finite CP complements when you compare them to, DP complements. So, the most old-fashioned examples you can think of are still relevant. CPs can complement adjectives and other non-case assigning predicates, whereas DPs can't. They combine with nouns in a way that doesn't make them look like arguments, and I'll say a bit more about that. So the fact that non is in brackets or parentheses is kind of relevant for CPs. They act like complements sometimes they don't. When you turn to OV languages, and even in English, but if you turn to OV languages, you see that CPs distribute differently. They don't like to sit before the verb. They like to extrapose. It's a common old fact, right? And there's been lots of accounts for this kind of behavior. So, CPs don't get case is one of the old ideas that predicts their distribution. And LFG gives CPs different grammatical functions from DPs. Newer versions give CPs different feature properties. Certainly CPs might have different prosodic properties that explain some of their distribution. Very true. Today I want to talk about another approach, which I think is compatible with the other ones too. I just think it might be needed as well. And that's the idea that CPs, or at least some of the more canonical ones where we talk about a lot, are predicates. And I call this the CP predicate hypothesis. And we'll see in detail what it is, but the basic idea is a that clause in English. A that clause in English doesn't saturate a predicate. It adds extra information. It's a type of modifier. It's not a saturator. And I'll use that terminology a bit in this talk. CPs, they don't saturate predicates. They somehow just add extra information. And today, so that's what I had worked on for in my dissertation and things following. Today I want to talk about CPs that are saturators. CPs that don't have the same signature as English that clauses, but do things that make them look like they're not just adjuncts or that have more complementary properties. And I call these saturating CPs, and they include, as we'll see, familiar things like ECM complements, and then a number of things that we'll talk about today, Bangla complements, Korean, Japanese, Zulu clauses. And of course, I decided to be maximally risky and talk about topics that I'm a novice in front of an audience with Japanese experts, Korean experts, I think there's Bangla experts, and just my luck, there's a Zulu expert in this. I wouldn't be surprised. So that's what we're going to look at today. Okay, what I'm going to tell you is that saturating and non-saturating CPs have a cluster of properties that distinguish them. Non-saturating CPs look like they're modifying, not complementing nouns. I'll tell you why I think this in a bit. Non-saturating CPs like to extrapose. We already saw that with the Bangla example. And non-saturating CPs are opaque for movement. Particularly, they're opaque for A movement. That shouldn't seem surprising at first because you think, well, yeah, you can't A move out of a finite CP. But saturating CPs, be they finite or not, show the opposite cluster of behaviors. They don't like to modify nouns. They don't like to combine with nouns, as we'll see. They're perfectly happy to sit where they're born. They're nice, good old complements. And they tend to be transparent for movements, be they finite or not, that non-saturating CPs aren't. Okay, and I'm going to derive the cluster of properties by distinguishing non-saturating CPs in their semantic type from saturating CPs. Non-saturating CPs, I'm going to just take the view that I've expounded, rightly or wrongly, for a while now, that they're predicates. They're type ET. Whereas saturating CPs, I'm going to argue, have a type that makes them look more like little chunks of the verb phrase. They're predicates of eventualities. And therefore, these CPs get integrated into the verbal spine, like any other argument gets incorporated into the verbal spine by an argument introducer. Okay? And this will derive the transparency of these clauses. It'll derive why saturating CPs sit where they do, why they can't combine with nouns, and why they're more transparent for movement operations, whereas the non-saturating ones aren't. So this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to tell you, do that thing that I always hated when invited speakers propounded an idea they had 10 years ago as if it was correct, but I'm going to do that in the background on familiar CPs. Then I'm going to tell you about some of these languages I've been nervous about talking about where they show a correlation that is the exactly opposite of English. Then I'm going to give you a proposal that reflects just what I told you, that non-saturating CPs are predicates of individuals, saturating CPs are predicates of events. And then I'm going to end with what I think is an interesting case from Bangla that sort of, you can really see in the same language the two things happening. And Okay, so here's the background. The CP predicate hypothesis argues that CPs aren't arguments, but they're predicates. So the first argument is that CPs can combine with nouns in a way that DP arguments can't. So you need a preposition to get an internal argument for a noun when it's a DP, but you absolutely can't have it, at least in English, when it's CP. And it turns out that it's not just about the fact that the DP needs case licensed and the CP is resistant to case. There's a lot of nominalizations that just resist taking arguments altogether. So he claimed that, fine, but the nominalization, his claim of that is deviant. There's some parses that might be fine, but it's when the that refers to what he claimed, it's not good. So here's the story. Look, the nominalization of claim and believe just don't like to take arguments in the first place. Yeah? So the fact that they can combine with CPs suggests their CPs aren't arguments. The second argument is that CP complements to nouns, and I put complements in quotes now because that's the whole issue. CP complements behave like modifiers in binding theoretic ways. So you've probably learned in sort of introductory syntax that when you have an argument of a moved noun phrase, that argument must obligatorily reconstruct, and it will produce conditioned disjoint reference effects, like in 6a, which depiction of John's face does he hate most? Okay. But adjuncts or modifiers of moved noun phrases appear to escape being fully reconstructed. Which book from John's library did he read suggesting they're modifiers? Yeah. And there's an analysis of why this should happen. It turns out that to the extent that these contrasts are real, the clausal arguments of nouns behave like modifiers in obviating condition C. So these go back to Kuno, but there's quite a few easy ways to show this. But the fact that John has been arrested, he generally fails to mention. Perfectly legitimate. Whose allegation that Lee was less than truthful did he refute? There's no disjoint reference effect here. Kuno was just very careful in setting up these examples, and that's why they come out good. Okay, so in that sense, CP complements to nouns behave like modifiers. Okay, and so the analysis we gave for this is that CPs describe sets of individuals. So here's a very informal idea that he's happy describes the set of things, the content of which is that he's happy. And ideas describes a set of things that are ideas, and the idea that John is happy describes a set of things that are ideas and the content of which is that he's happy. Okay? So they just intersect. Why is that? Oh, here's the more formal version. Or more formal, it's still pretty informal. But with lambdas and world variables is all that's different here. A CP that John is a liar is a function that takes an individual with content. This little c means you're talking about ideas and stories and news, not like tables and chairs. And so what it says is that the content of that thing is the proposition. It's the proposition that John is a liar. You can define the content function as a way to recover sets of worlds from stories and newspapers. Nouns like rumor, idea, and story are also of the same semantic type, so then CP is just combined by predicate modification. This, what I showed you at first, is the same as this. This just has more lambdas and stuff. Okay, so so the story that John is a liar is something like the unique thing with propositional content that's a story, and the content of that thing is the proposition that John is a liar. Okay, the important bit here is that the CP is a predicate. It's not a proposition, it's a predicate of things. Okay, and the idea is that we'll allow it to combine with nouns that don't otherwise take arguments. You can always intersect with a noun phrase. And your CP complements to nouns will bleed condition C, because we know that's how you bleed condition C, by late merging. And you can only late merge if you're an adjunct, not a modifier. Okay. So that's the story. That's the initial motivation for seeing CPs in English, at least, as predicates, not arguments. And then I did a crazy thing a couple years ago and said, hey, why don't we just make all CPs predicates, even the ones that appear to complement verbs? And I had a story that CPs, if they're predicates, actually can't complement verbs if they stay in situ. Okay? The types won't work out, maybe. But they will successfully integrate into the sentence if they move a little bit and traces or copies get to saturate things, because traces and copies get to have a different type than the thing that moved, right? Think quantifiers. Traces of quantifiers get to have types that work to integrate. And I sort of argued, well, this pushed the CP to the periphery, so that's why in German and in Bangla and Hindi, CPs go to the right, and various other things. Okay? So I'm not going to, I'm going to assume this view rather than defend it. Because we're going to move on. Okay. But not all CPs in languages have the kinds of properties I just used to motivate the predicate analysis for English. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to show you saturating CPs. And I'm going to use the diagnostic of whether they can combine directly with a noun as a diagnostic. So English CPs can combine with common nouns happily, but we're going to see some other CPs that don't combine with nouns happily. We've actually seen a few today already. We're going to see that these CPs also stay in situ, they don't extrapose, and they're more transparent for A movement. And I'm going to argue that the contrast between saturating and non-saturating CPs and the ability to A move from them is a consequence of Muller's generalization. Okay? So actually, this talk is going to be explaining why you can't hyperraise from English. Is what this talk is, not why you can hyperraise in other languages. English is the weirdo here. Okay. So I've shown you this already, but just to remind you, I'm now going to run through the languages I'm scared of telling you about by showing you that they're saturating, they can't modify nouns, they don't have to extrapose, and they're transparent for A movement. Okay, so we're going to start with Korean go clauses. We've seen this data point already today. Korean go clauses can complement verbs. That's what 11a shows you, the verb claim here. But if you just stick them next to the nominalization claim, they're no good. We already saw this data point today, actually. Okay? So these CPs don't combine with nouns. They combine with verbs. If you want to have a CP to combine with a noun, you've got to stick in the add nominal marker. We already saw that today. And you don't get the co-complementizer. Okay. So that's the first data point about Korean. Co-complements don't combine with nouns. They're also, co-clauses are transparent for raising to object. So, Mary, John, accusative long ago, great thought, declarative. Great thought. Okay, Mary thought John long ago to be great, right? And you can see this argument is in the matrix clause because there's a matrix adverbial interpolated between it and its base position. Okay? Whenever you're dealing with hyper-raising or raising out of finite clauses, there's the elephant in the room. Are these really movement or are these base generation? Is this a prolepsis analysis? I'm assuming this is movement, and Hong and Lasnik try to rule out a prolepsis account. But it's always going to be floating in the ether here. But let's just, for this to, you're going to have to be on my side that this is movement to make this an interesting talk. So, okay. Japanese toe clauses. Here, they like to combine with verbs, unexceptionally. But when they combine with nouns, several things happen that make them look different than English. If you combine it with a derived noun, I guess this is derived, you got to stick in the genitive marker. Okay, already looking very different from English. Okay, this is what you do with arguments of nouns. You stick in a genitive. Well, this is what you're doing with arguments of nouns, even if they're a CP. You stick in a genitive. Okay? So already they're looking a little less like modifiers and more like true arguments. And if you have a non-argument taking noun like fact is not a relational noun. It's just a common noun, fact. Okay? You can't combine it with, you can't even rescue it with the genitive, as reported in Ogawa at least. You have to add a little, this little form, toyu, I believe, and there's people here who know about this. You got to add this extra little bit that's like a verb of saying. So the fact, maybe saying that he was here yesterday. Okay? But my point is, you've got to do something extra in this language. You can't just stick a toe clause with a noun. You got to do something extra. And if it were a predicate, if it were like English, you'd expect it just to combine with the noun without any little rescuing operations. It doesn't. Okay. So toe clauses are saturators. And what's the correlating fact? Toe clauses also allow raising to object. So the clauses out of which you raise to object appear to have these toe complementizers. Believes the man to be a swindler. Again, the same caveats apply. Is this really prolepsis or movement? But on the movement account, this is indeed raising to object. Okay? Getting out of more familiar languages, Zulu has a pattern that looks surprisingly similar too. So Zulu has a variety of complementizers that one of these is this little guy, I think it's Ikuti, okay, translated as that. It doesn't like to combine with nominals, so the thought that the zombies arrived, you can't just stick this plain old Ikuti clause next to the noun. Yeah? What you got to do is something different. You've got to add associative morphology. Okay? Now, the associative morphology is just what happens elsewhere in the language when a noun modifies another noun. Okay? But the point here is that this alone is not a predicate. You got to do some work to it to make it a predicate. Okay? Not like English, right? English, that clauses you don't need to do any work to make them modify nouns. But these guys, just like Korean and Japanese, you got to do a little work to get them to combine with nouns. And you can guess what the correlative fact is here. Zulu allows hyper-raising from just these clauses. So it's got raising to object and subject. Here's a raising to subject. So here, it can stay in situ, seems that's that complementizer. Jinlei needed the bread, but you can also get your Jinlei seems like he needed the bread. Okay? So, we found some CPs that don't like to combine with nouns without some extra work. They're transparent for A movement. And I should also say they don't have to extrapose, like Japanese and Korean clauses like to stay in the middle field, right? They're not like German. They stay there. That's sort of an obvious point that many people derive, but it fits. Okay. In addition to Korean, Japanese, and Zulu, I think English fits this pattern too. We just don't normally think of this way when we look at ECM in English. So there's a famous fact about ECM in English that ECM doesn't combine with nouns. Now, this goes back to Keir. So we believed Mia to be honest. Our belief of Mia to be honest is bad. And the question is, why can't the case rescuing of work here? This is what we do to rescue case. Okay? We stick in an of. And the question is, why doesn't that allow an ECM complement to belief? Same with raising, Mary's appearance to be happy. Okay? Yeah, Chomsky said something about the of being more like inherent case, and it must mark its own argument and stuff. But this still remains a long-standing puzzle. The same pattern shows up with small clause complements. This will be sort of important. We believed her to be the best, fine, but our belief of her the best, no good. But here's a crucial thing. It's not that small clauses can't complement nouns. When you move to perception predicates, they're perfectly happy complementing nouns. We saw Mia happy. The sight of Mia happy is perfectly good compared to the belief of Mia happy. What's the difference between a nominalization like sight and a nominalization like believe? Well, independently we can show that sight is perfectly happy to take arguments like any other nominalization, whereas belief isn't. So you can sort of feel this with these copular tests. You can say something like the belief was that Mary was happy, where belief here is just identified with the that clause. But sight doesn't. The sight was that Mary was happy. Just no good. Even though you can say saw that Mary was happy. Moreover, here's like a really dumb, straight up example. There's something deviant about the belief of that idea. You sort of need a lexical preposition there, belief in which case we're dealing with something else. But the sight of that event is perfectly unacceptable. Here's the idea, and I'll show you how we implement it. Sight takes arguments. Sight is a nominalization like destruction or just all the things you read in your textbooks. It takes arguments, and one of those arguments could be a small clause, and of can rescue case on the subject of that small clause. Belief doesn't take arguments, and moreover, the kinds of clauses that small clauses and ECM clauses are, they're not predicate modifiers. Yeah? The only way belief can combine with a clause is through predicate modification. ECM clauses are like Korean ko clauses, Japanese to clauses, Zulu ukuti clauses. They're saturators. They're not predicate modifiers. Okay. So here will be the idea, hyperraising, or even ECM in English, has nothing to do with tense, has nothing to do with case, has nothing to do with the defectiveness of the left periphery. Well, I shouldn't say has nothing. Those are not sufficient and necessary conditions. One condition is whether the clause is a saturator or not. Okay. So how are we going to cash this out? Well, remember I told you that my view was that in English, CPs had to move in order to be integrated into the clause. This is non-saturating CPs. Well, this is going to frustrate hyperraising and ECM. Why is it going to frustrate hyperraising in ECM? Well, because ECM and hyperraising are themselves movement operations. So if we believe a raising to object analysis of ECM, what this means is if you wanted to ECM or hyperraise in English, you would be creating a remnant movement configuration. You would have to move the ECM element and then remnant move the CP. Now, remnant movement is possible in principle, but we know one thing about remnant movement. is that remnant movement doesn't like the two movements to be the same movements. So this goes back to Müller. So these are more fancy movements than the ones we're talking about, but the idea is like when the diving movement, the remnant creating movement is scrambling, you can then A-bar the remnant, but you can't scramble both. So they must be distinct movements. Well, what do we know about the movements that CPs undergo? The movements that CPs undergo to the right, which we used to call extraposition, those are A movements too. They're, at least in the sense that they're clause-bound. Yeah, they're clause-bounded. They obey right roof in a way like heavy NP shift doesn't, by the way. Okay, the CP movement I invoke for non-saturating CPs is A movement. ECM is A movement. Therefore, by Müller's generalization, they just can't co-occur. So the reason you don't get raising to object out of finite clauses in English is because of a violation of Müller's generalization. As far as I know, no one thought that should be the case, but there you go. Okay, now of course you can A-bar move out of an A move phrased. Yeah, so non-saturating CPs in English are transparent for A-bar movement. Nothing prevents that from happening. Okay. Now, let's go back to Korean and Japanese and Zulu. Well, they're just going to be like English clauses in the sense that they're going to be saturators, not non-saturators. So in a way, they're the uninteresting case from this perspective. The CPs are perfectly happy to be arguments of verbs, so they don't invoke any movement to get them integrated, so they don't invoke Müller's generalization, and they're transparent for operations. And they don't combine with nouns because nouns can't combine with arguments without something special. Of course, now the question is, what is the semantics of saturating CPs such that this works out this way? And what is the semantics of ECM complements that allow them to compose in situ and disallows them from combining with nouns? Here's the proposal. Saturating CPs are predicates of eventualities, and this will prevent them from combining with verbs. No, I said that backwards. This will prevent them from combining with nouns, but they'll be perfectly happy to combine with verbs. Okay, this is not the idea that some embedded clauses target the eventuality argument is not a new idea. When this idea of getting content from individuals percolated, starting with Valentin Haccard's dissertation, there was some waffling between whether you recovered content from an individual or whether you recovered content from an eventuality. Haccard had content recovered from eventualities. As I was writing my dissertation, I started that way, and then I moved to individuals. But it's looking like both options are available. And what I want to say is that Korean to clauses, Japanese ko clauses, backwards, I know, Japanese ko, English ECM clauses, they recover content from eventualities. So this formula is really just like the formula I gave you for English that clauses, except that instead of the content coming from an individual, it comes from an event. Okay? And the philosophers can tell us what it means to recover content from an eventuality. But it would be the eventuality from claiming. So like, well, I'll show you in a bit what that could mean. Okay? So the idea here is that events like claim, states like believe carry informational content, and that content is compatible with a particular claim and a particular belief state. Okay, so here's how the compositions work. The ko clause, the ko and the to, they just suck up a proposition, and then they give you a predicate of eventualities, and then that predicate of eventualities combines with the verb, which here I treat as just an intransitive verb. Elizabeth Bogle-Albritton has argued extensively for this view from Navajo, for instance. Okay, so in a way, calling these saturating is maybe a bit misleading. This proposition integrates into the verbal projection by a little head that combines by event identification, like any other argument that's introduced in the verb phrase. Think little v's and so on. Okay, so you get meanings like, for just like the simple Mina claimed that Swoona solved the problem, what these sentences sort of come out as saying is like, there's an event whose agent is Mina, it's a claiming event, and the propositional content of that event is all worlds compatible with that propositional content. In all those worlds, Swoona solved the problem. So there's a particular view of what it means to talk about the content of a claim. Okay? But the crucial combinatoric issue is that an eventuality property can't combine with a simple noun phrase. So these can't combine with nouns. Okay? English ECM must have the same profile. There must be some head in English ECM that integrates the proposition and gives you a type that allows the clause to compose in situ. I actually sort of thought I needed something like this at one point, and I didn't know what to call it. I called it F-docs, because I called the null element in ECM an embedder that required doxastic meanings. But I didn't really have any evidence for this. But my thinking now is that this is a reflection of the same thing that's going on in Korean and Japanese. There's an argument introducing head that integrates a proposition and allows it to combine with a verb. And of course, it's not surprising that this thing is transparent for a movement, because it doesn't move itself, it stays in situ, so it's transparent for a movements and a bar movements. Okay. And it captures, just as it did in Korean and Japanese, it captures why belief, if it's just a simple property of individuals, can't combine with these clauses, because that's the wrong semantic type. Okay. Sure, stick of into rescue case all you want. The reason the belief of Mary to be upset is ill-formed is because of a type clash, not because of a case problem. The reason you can say something like the sight of Sue happy is because sight, unlike belief, is an argument taker. Now, you see events, so that's why I have sight taking an event. And the small clause Sue happy here perhaps gets nominalized. But the point is, this is happy here, and of can rescue case on small clauses in nominals, as long as that small clause has a way to integrate into the noun, typewise. In interest of time, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip, I'll say one thing. The way ECM clauses integrate then is not via, ECM clauses integrate into the host predicate as event descriptions. So it's not surprising that they can't associate with nominal clausal proforms. Like, I believed it all along Sue to be upset is no good, but I believed it all along that Sue was upset. So ECM clauses, you can think of them as more eventy and verby, and they can't associate with a nominal expletive, whereas the finite that clauses are happy to. Nothing I've said totally explains that, but it's going to be a nice thing to see in a second. We're going to skip that. Okay, so interim summary, and I know that sounds funny 5 minutes before ending, but I've analyzed ECM and hyperraising as not a distinction between tense or the defectiveness of the clause, but as at least partially explained by whether the CPs from which you move are saturating or not. And this came from what looks to be at least an initial correlation between whether a clause allows hyperraising and whether it can combine with a noun unaccompanied. Okay? And then I argued the way to analyze these is that saturating CPs involve eventuality-based propositional embedding, which made the embedder look more like a chunk of the verbal spine, the matrix verbal spine, not not a predicate modifier. Okay. In the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about, last 10 minutes. Okay, so I have 10 minutes for this. Okay, so I want to talk about a paradigm was made famous and been worked a lot in Bangla. Bangla is an OV language, but it has a complementation system that's more native and one that's not. There's one complementation system that uses the final complementizer, bole, and this guy likes to sit. It likes to sit, well, it can sit immediately preceding the verb. Okay? And it's less happy, although I believe it's possible for it to extrapose. It can maybe even move leftwards. Okay? So that's this bole guy. Okay. There's another complementizer, which is an initial complementizer with this J guy. And this looks more like, what you would see in German or something, where it's an OV language, but the CP likes to extrapose rightward, and it's unhappy, if not completely out, in the middle field, or whatever you want to call that. Okay? Now, there are differences between these two clauses in a number of respects. And there's a number of sources for this. So these J clauses like to combine with nouns, but the bole clauses don't. That should sound familiar. English finite CPs like to combine with nouns, but ECM don't. The same is true of Korean ko, Japanese to. J clauses have a DP correlate, but bole clauses don't. That was also true of ECM. I showed you that briefly. It's hard to get certain factive interpretations with bole clauses. We'll see that that's somewhat true of English as well. This one, I'll show you in a bit. You can get things that might look small clausey with bole clauses, and you can in English as well. And in some respects, bole clauses are a little bit more transparent. Okay, so I'm trying to argue to add yet another complementation strategy that looks like ECM in this language. So here's the data. Bole clauses don't combine with content nouns. She knew this talk. Ram yesterday died yesterday, right? So with the noun, but it's perfectly happy with the initial complementizer J. Okay? If you want to think about it, this looks like ECM. This looks like Korean ko. Bole clauses don't have DP correlates, so this looks like ECM. So the boy heard it, his father will come, no good. But the J clauses, like English that clauses, are perfectly happy with DP correlates. Okay? This is a fact about the interpretation. SICOGG reports that bole clauses aren't good with certain types of factives, like realized and forget. So Ram thought, but they are good with things like think, know, hear. No? So it's not a simple factive, non-factive split. She calls it factive versus strong factive. And ECM is like this too. ECM can combine with believe and think, but it can also combine with weak factives. I heard him to be a winner, I knew him to be a winner, but it's not so good with I forgot him to be a winner, I realized him to be a winner. Okay? Bole clauses also don't have to embed a finite clause. So here's an example where the bole clause looks like it's introducing a predicate here, brilliant, and the argument of this predicate is either in some type of object case or perhaps dative. But this looks more like a small clause than a big old finite clause is all I'm saying here. Nothing, I'm not saying anything fancy, it's just, it looks like a small clause, or at least a clause where the argument of brilliant is case licensed in a way from higher up. Okay. And in other ways, bole clauses are a little more transparent than J clauses. So bole clauses, WH in situ takes obligatory wide scope. So this means who did the boy think will come, whereas in J clauses, the WH word takes obligatory narrow scope. So in that sense, the boule clauses are more transparent. Okay. So this is that. So this is this connection. There's something tantalizing about comparing boule clauses to English ECM and J clauses to English finite clausal complements. That's what I mean here, finite clausal complements. Okay, so here's the wild speculation. Here's another fact. Boule, much like the Zulu complementizer we saw earlier, is derived from a verb of saying. Okay? And here's my bigger message. Maybe what we've discovered is a split in complementizer types. Between verby complementizers, some of them are absolutely verby because they have some verbs in them, or other complementizers that may not be derived from verbs of saying but have verby properties. And what I mean by verby properties is they're tied to eventualities. They're invoked by event-based proposition embedding, not by individual proposition embedding. Whereas we've got these other things that are, in a way, sort of outliers in a way. These J clauses in Bangla, notice that also is related to the relativizer. The that clauses in English, the das clauses in German, also that is related to the relativizer. So those I'll call the predicate ECPs. Yeah. Whereas the other guys that show the cluster of behaviors I'm interested in are the more verby Cs. Yeah, and I think there's ideas like this floating around quite a bit now, that there are embedders that are tied to the eventuality. Okay, so just as some last thoughts, I think what we call complementizers in natural languages should sometimes more be thought of elements of the matrix verbal spine. They're not like Cs that introduce a new domain, a new CP domain. They're more like elements of the matrix verbal spine, just like you would think of applicative heads are elements of the matrix verbal spine that introduce arguments, little V's and so on. And since the embedder is part of the matrix verbal spine, that will integrate the clause more fully into the matrix clause. It won't require any fancy movements to integrate that clause into the matrix clause. And so the idea is that they'll be more transparent than the other complement clauses that maybe we see in English and English finite clauses. And I think what this suggests is complementizer is just maybe becoming a little bit of a difficult word to be using as much anymore. I would like to use the word maybe clause embedder, because we're often tied to thinking complementizers come with a cluster of properties, which in a way they don't. And here's one proposal that clause embedders can either be verby or more predicate-y. And thank you.